Good morning. It is Sunday, September 27th, and we're now just a little over a month away to the election. Um, what has really not been talked about too much at all in mainstream media or almost anywhere is foreign policy. Foreign policy is one of the most, if not the most important thing that a president has to deal with, that almost none of the other elected officials, senators or congressmen, are centered on. The president is the one that gets involved with treaties and foreign policy. The president, the executive branch, drives pretty much, with the help of the Senate, or looking for the support of the Senate to move forward on war and other issues. Excuse me. More allergy issues. So foreign policy is something we need to talk about because it's really not talked about almost anywhere. And this president that is in the White House now has an horrendous list of items that he's not accomplished over the past almost 4 years. He has, in spite, I suppose, of, I guess, his personal leanings, there has been no war that has been ended. He has announced from time to time of wanting to take people out of certain Middle Eastern or Asian countries. The problem with that is that they are ending up in other Asian countries or African countries and not brought home. The amount of people that have been brought home is minuscule, if any. So we're still talking about a United States military that has hundreds and hundreds of bases around the globe. Depending on how, I suppose, an individual looks at it, the United States should have a handful of bases, maybe, and that's about it. To protect trade, maybe, and for what else? For what other reason? To be the perpetual policeman of the universe, of the earth, and for the American taxpayer to pay for that for decades and a century onward just doesn't make any sense to anybody. This is not World War One. We don't live in a post-World War II era anymore. This is no longer post-World War II. I was born in the 1950s, and which was post-World War II. We're not in that world now, by and large. The world has moved on, and it has developed. There are manufacturing. There are countries that are around the globe that are manufacturers that have developed, and this is not a bombed out post World War II era. Um, there are things that need to be changed because some things have not changed, and that's what needs to be dealt with. This president, let's start with the Middle East. And what this president has clearly done, which is side strictly with Israel. And as a Jewish American, I'm offended by everything that this president has done. And I want to say that most Jewish people in the United States, not that I represent them, but seven and a half out of every 10 Jewish Americans have consistently voted Democratic since World War II to this very day. Most of them are liberal and or progressive. They are not conservative. there is a very small and somewhat vocal conservative part of the Jewish community, and that's their prerogative. But they are not the majority in this country, and they do not speak for the couple of million Jewish people who live. I think approximately 3 million Jewish people live in the United States. They don't speak for most of them. Um, the the policy of moving Jerusalem, moving Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as the capital, or the United States Embassy, only gets in the way of a bigger issue, a bigger, more complex issue that has been going on for about 150 years or so, and with, of course, the United States and the British and the French all involved. But by and large, you have, not to get into the historical uh, issues of this deeply, we live in today's world. And in today's world, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, um, it is time, way past time, it is 2 generations past time, that people living in those 2 areas, Arab people living in those 2 areas, are uh, are dignified with their own state, just like the Jewish people who demanded the world to be represented in the United Nations during the 1940s. The Jewish people begged the world and demanded from the world and got from the world that dignity. Well, it is time that the dignity of all the people of that region are represented and respected. And actually, a very strong uh, Gaza Strip, a very strong and robust West Bank would be in the best interest of Israel, because with all the players in the Middle East, strong and secure and strong, I don't mean militarily strong, I mean culturally strong, strong in their own government, strong with their own citizenship, strong in having human rights and trade among the players of the world, just like Israel had demanded back in the 1940s. Uh, those people should be accorded the same exact dignity and respect that the Jewish state received right after World War II. And that was a complicated period of time. I'm not going to rehash it, but it is no secret that there was a Jewish immigration back to the region where the Jewish people originally came from, but there were other people who were also living there. And so it is a very complicated issue. It was split up, as many people know, it was split up by the French and the British. It was done on a napkin during World War One by Sykes and Picot, 2 ambassadors, low-level ambassadors from France and England, and that's how we had. That's how the Middle East, the modern Middle East, was created, on that napkin during World War II in Paris in a cafe. That's how the Middle East was created, the modern Middle East, and the borders and the boundaries. And so for that to continue must end. That is something, again, that this generation must address. It is the bigger issue. It must end, and it has to end with the people of uh, Gaza and the people of the West Bank. What is left of the West Bank must be made into an independent state. And if the United Nations, for a period of time, need to be at the borders, then they must be, to keep both sides away from each other. There has to be a separation. But for those uh, who are looking long term, it is in the interest of everybody in that region because nobody's going anywhere. That is the home of Gaza. Those are the Gazans. They are the home of the people from the West Bank, uh, Palestinians. They are the home of Lebanese, of Syrians. These are the people that live there, and Israelis. And it is time they all recognize that they are all should be afforded their own dignity, their own state, their own freedom, their own human rights. And they should all actually be working strongly together to strengthen those cultural ties. By DNA, we are closely related. Uh, by trade, by language, by history, the people of those countries need to move forward together completely and with complete trust. And it's time for the fringe elements in all of these societies to to finally accept that they live on the same part of the planet and they are not going anywhere. None of them are. And this presidency has created a bigger problem over a long period of time because over the long haul, over the trend that he's creating is only in the end, somewhere down the road, is going to create wars that just simply go on forever because one side is being granted uh, carte blanche and annexation eventually over the West Bank that it doesn't have any legal authority to do so. That land is not theirs. This is stuff that we were talking about back in 1968 when I was in Hebrew school. That Israel was eventually going to take the West Bank. We were talking about it in 1968, and I was looking at a map. I'm 12 years old, and I knew right then that that was wrong. I'm looking at a map in Teaneck, New Jersey, in Temple Emmett, and I saw as the teacher was talking, I'm thinking to myself, there are people living there. We're going to annex it from who? From where? Legally, illegally? Doesn't matter. You know, um, didn't make sense then. It makes a lot less sense now. Anyway, so the Democratic Party has a somewhat better record. Although both parties, as I've mentioned, are driven by oil. And that's another issue on foreign policy. Since the day I was born, the United States has been fighting oil wars, natural resource wars, whether it is in Vietnam, uh, somewhere in Africa or South America, in Venezuela, in Nigeria, elsewhere, everywhere, whether these wars became public, whether they became secret CIA wars, they just continue for decades on end because it's about money and money and money and oil and money and oil and money and oil. So these are the things that need to end. There's a greater chance of that happening with Biden being elected. Now, I'm not stupid. And I've said all along that both people running for president have horrible records when it comes to peace and when it comes to understanding what the future really requires, that the world is changing, that we don't live in a post World War II era, that we no longer live in an oil era, that we live in a green energy, renewable era. And because all the wars during the 20th century have all been oil wars, basically, And all the men and women who have died for this country have basically died not for freedom, uh, except for possibly World War II, but basically for oil uh, or natural resources. And that has to end because we don't live in that era anymore. And I see parts of the Democratic Party reaching out to that. The Republican Party is just hopeless. And so I would hope and think that if you are looking, if you're, first of all, if you're under the age of 40, that you would be voting for your interest in the long term and voting for a party that is more going to fight for green energy, not only in the United States, but around the world, so that we don't send people all over the world defending oil and oil shipments and oil ports and oil pipelines that pollute everywhere and are more supportive of a green energy policy worldwide. Because now we do live in a truly, we live in on Earth. You know, if a Vulcan came, if Spock and his parents came today from Vulcan, you know, they would be in shock that this planet is still actually fighting for oil while and polluting the planet that we are on for oil and fighting over it while we have the technology to actually take all of our energy from the sun, all of it, and so that the earth is clean and we're not killing each other over natural resources. Anybody from another part of the galaxy or solar system would just look at us and say, "You're a bunch of idiots." So, to be serious, it's a very serious issue. It is the most serious issue, more serious than any other issue, is to stop these oil wars and stop polluting the earth. All of those issues are leaning towards the Democrats as the better party. You have the Republican Party that wants to continue to frack from one side of the planet to the other. Um, I'm saying the Republicans have the Democrats have a better record. They are not clean on any of these issues, but they are slightly better, and they can be worked with at least to a certain extent. And the more we get more progressive Democrats involved, the closer the long term goals will finally be attained. And that's what we want. That's what we're fighting for. That's the ultimate goal in all of this. Um, our foreign policy really needs to be driven not by oil, but by human rights uh, and the cleaning up of our planet. The cleaning up of our planet, the cleaning up of pollution, the movement away from oil to green energy. That is foreign policy now because the wars of oil must end. And the net resources that we have, the money and the men and the women, are being simply wasted going into these wars, going into a military that is spread out all over the planet. It is draining this country and draining its energy and draining its will to change anything. We should be doing everything we can to dismantle every single large oil company and simply dismantle it and turn those companies into green energy companies. Um, that's what needs to happen immediately. Another policy that needs to happen on an international basis is that all automobiles from 2 years from now, 24 months from today, not one fossil fuel engine should be manufactured. Not one. Anywhere in the world. So that oil, the era of oil is over. Not 20 or 30 years from now, but 2 years from now. It can be done. Actually, it can be done easily. Easily, it can be done. It's a matter of will. It is a matter of actually seeing and understanding and putting our planet ahead of all the nonsense that humanity is putting in front of itself. Or I really should say, the United States is putting in front of itself. Most of humanity is wanting very badly to move forward with green energy, the green energy era. One last thing on foreign policy is that it is time for the United States to return to the world of diplomacy and supporting the infrastructure of talking to our friends and our enemies. And really, the whole idea of enemies, again, in the 21st century, it should be finished. The past 100 centuries is another story. We live in a world now where humanity can, one, blow itself right off the planet. Two, we are in a world now where we are about to have pollution and plastics and chemicals. Either we're going to have a polluted world or we're not. A world that is heating up or not. And we don't have enemies. There are no enemies. We are all living on this planet, and that is the only way to look at it. There is no other way to look at it. There is no other option. We live on this planet together. There is no other way to look at it. To look at it in the old way is immature, it's ignorant, and it is wrong, and it's backwards, and um, and it actually doesn't help anybody. So um, the things to be supporting is the United Nations, the World Health Organization. It is human rights. Human rights is number one. The rights of the individual is number one. The brilliance of the UN Charter of Franklin Roosevelt is, and Thomas Jefferson to a small extent, and to Thomas Paine, and to all the others who believe very strongly in human rights as base, the basis for civilization and for the basis of existence for humanity. That it should be number one politically around the world. Human rights should be driving our foreign policy. The United States needs to return back to the World Court and needs to abide by it. And as I've been advocating now for about a decade, it is time that the United Nations Security Council reflect a different world, the world of today and tomorrow, the 21st and 22nd centuries, and not the last 75 years when the United Nations was created in 1945 and 46. There are 5 members that became part of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, Russia, China, England, France. Basically, the winners of World War II. I am not for, well, I would like to see there be a change, but I'm actually looking for what I've been advocating for the past decade or more is an increase, because back then in 1945 and 6 there were only about 50 or 60 countries that were uh, founding members of the United Nations. There's now over 200 nations and territories that belong to the United Nations. Back then there were only 3 billion people, and now there's 7 or 8 billion people. So there needs to be an increase in the Security Council, the Permanent Security Council. The first one is probably the most obvious. And we're talking about now spreading out the geography of these countries, the memberships, the representation of countries that are not really represented in groups. The first country is India. That seems pretty obvious. It's got 1.2 billion people. Only China has more. India may very well become number one in population soon. Its economy will probably surpass that of the United States also sometime during this century. It would also become the very first country on the Security Council to be located in the Indian Ocean. And those countries need to be represented. Next would be the Philippines, which would be the second country that would be bordering the South China Sea, but for very good reason. It would be the only country representing the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Rim, and quote unquote Oceania, which is basically the island world of the Pacific Ocean. The Philippines now has over 110 million people. It is 12th or thereabouts in population worldwide. Has more people than England or France, and it is an incredible. It is located in one of the most important locations in the world, possibly the most important location in the world, because it borders on the South China Sea. That's where 70% of all trade goes through, and it is also where China is possibly moving militarily to expand or colonize their natural resources and other interests. And the Philippines is right in their target. And that is why the Philippines is so important. They also have a very important base of skilled workers, of workers who speak 2 and 3 languages. They don't speak only Tagalog, which is Filipino. They also speak Chinese and Vietnamese and English. And many of them speak all of those languages fluently, and Arabic, by the way. The Philippines is a very international country. And any talk of expanding the United Nations Security Council should be including the Philippines. They would also represent all island nations. The next country would be Egypt. The Middle East needs to be represented finally in the Security Council. Egypt has the longest history. It is the largest in population of the Middle Eastern countries, and I think would be able to handle the role as and or become a leader in that part of the world by example, and work with and it has been working with Israel for decades now. It has that history to work with, and I believe that having Egypt in the Security Council would help the Middle East move forward, have their voices heard where the decisions are being made. Not to have a Middle Eastern country in the Security Council is absurd and a non-starter for the next century. It's idiotic and narrow-minded. And if you're against it, I'll say it straight out, then you're not interested in peace. You're not interested. You don't care about peace. You don't care about living with other people. You don't care. You have to have a diversity of nations in the Security Council. This is simply not post World War II anymore. It is time to grow up and to move forward. Next is Argentina. And that is, I'm sorry, before we get to Argentina, Egypt would be the first of two countries that would be finally representing the continent of Africa. Africa has nobody on the Security Council, no voice. 700 million people on the continent of Africa presently has no voice. There should be two nations from Africa. One is Northern Africa, which is Egypt, which is the Middle East. Two is Nigeria, which is Central Africa, and is actually by population the largest country on the continent. They also need to have their sovereignty reestablished because of the oil wars and the oil interests that have been going on there, basically silently or semi-silently, or by secret wars or proxy wars. People have been The people of Nigeria and the surrounding countries uh, need to move forward into the 21st century, and their voices need to be heard, and their dignity and their right as human beings need to be secured. And that is the best way to do it. Next is Argentina, which again, South America, incredibly, another continent with no representation on the Security Council for the last 75 years. Most people would think Brazil, and I am holding off on that. I used to think that, but I think that would be a mistake because of where Brazil is right now politically. They are at war with themselves politically. They have moved to the right. They are wiping out the Amazon rainforest, which in and of itself needs to stop for the interests of the planet and the people breathing. And I think most people around the world breathe. And so I don't see the nation of Brazil as mature enough to take care of itself, let alone be involved with the issues of the world. They are oil rich, and they are taking advantage of it. And not to say that any other country is mature enough, but I see Brazil going 100 miles an hour into the wrong direction, and they need to wake up. Uh, Argentina, I believe, has gone through its issues. I believe that they are an incredibly important country. They are. They would again be the only country in South America that would be represented. So they would be representing the continent. I believe they are diplomatically and historically mature enough to do that and to become part of the world on that level. And part of the country is very close to the South Pole, Antarctica, and that trade route. And it is important that Argentina becomes part of the Security Council because they have interests in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, and with Chile to keep that part of the world uh, free of pollution and to keep it clean. So it's important that Argentina is part of the Security Council. The last country is Mexico. And some people would say you can't have two countries that are right next to each other. Well, China and Russia are right next to each other. Okay, If you haven't noticed on a map, China and Russia border each other. England and France, okay, well, they have the English Channel, but they're right next to each other. So don't tell me that you can't have two countries next to each other. Mexico would be representing all of Central America and Spanish speaking countries like Argentina. And there are enough Spanish speaking countries around this planet where you need to have at least one, if not two, countries that are representing a huge part of the population of the world. Right now, there is none, zero. To continue on as we are going is an equation of automatic failure. We have to change the institutions of our planet from the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries to the 20th and the 21st and 22nd centuries. We have to move forward into the future so that the institutions of yesterday and today can become institutions for tomorrow and the next century. So they can deal with the issues of the 21st and 22nd century. That is what needs to happen. I do not believe that Donald Trump has a clue on any of these things. Uh, he is interested, I believe strongly, in simply making money for himself, his family, his interests, and nothing else. I don't believe it. And if that's his track record, I believe. He has not ended any wars. He's not stopped anything. He's increased the dependency on fossil fuels, which is unbelievably backwards. And the dependence on fossil fuels is an equation of war. And war is an old equation of the 17th and 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, and we don't belong in that world anymore. The people who are being born now, who have been born during the last 20 years, who are going to live through this century, this is not their world of Donald Trump. They have a different world, and that world is the future. The world not of oil, but of renewables, of green energy, of peace, of human rights, individual human rights. That is what this world should be based on. There is no such thing as the enemy. There is that thinking is 15th century and gets nowhere. The final part of this of foreign policy is the defunding. Talk about defunding. It's defunding the $1 trillion infrastructure of the military industrial complex. That has been going on since World War II. It has wasted the resources of my generation, the baby boom generation. It has stolen our generation's energy and resources and manpower for war and destruction. And it has taken the next couple of generations and done the same thing. And it is time for the military industrial complex to be torn apart and to be put together again only at a minimal level and only with human rights as its mission and nothing else. Human rights and to another lesser and to a lesser degree world trade, international trade. My educational background is international law and international trade and the environmental outlook of the oceans. That's my background in education and my undergrad degree. So that's it for right now. That's what I think about foreign policy. It is not talked about at all, really. And I believe most of the people who are on TV don't have a clue because they don't, and they don't understand relationships, trade relationships, um, currency relationships. All of it needs to change for the 21st and 22nd centuries. That's where I am on that. I do believe voting blue and voting Democratic is a slightly better vote. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Maybe in the next couple of hours.